So, hello everybody, and welcome to this fourth event in a week-long celebration of 50 years of Birkbeck politics. My name is Ben Worthy. I'm the director of the Centre for British Political Life here at Birkbeck, but more importantly than that, with us we have Lisa Nandy. Lisa, are you there?
Oh, yeah, I am. The wonders of modern technology. Hello, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Lisa, welcome back to Birkbeck. We last had you back here, I believe, in 2015 when you were part of a debate on a progressive alliance. And before that, you also spoke to my parliamentary studies students. So thank you once again for coming along. Lisa, as most of you know, is Secretary of State for Levelling Up, or as she likes to term it, rebuilding, housing and communities. But she has had a very long political career before then. I'm just going to skip very briefly through it. Lisa was born in Manchester. She studied in Newcastle for undergraduate, and most importantly, she did her postgraduate degree here at Birkbeck Politics. She worked for the Children's Society and a homeless charity before serving as a local councillor in Hammersmith and Fulham for 4 years. She became MP for Wigan in 2010, and since then her roles have included Shadow Minister for Children and Families and Civil Society, Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. She stood to be Labour leader in 2020, and as if she found any more time, she's also the co-founder of the Centre for Towns, which you must all have heard of. This week, she gave a speech about local government where she promised to smash a century of centralism, and talked about rebuilding rather than levelling up, and rebuilding that crucial ingredient around local council and politics called trust. So, having given you that very long list of things that have happened, I think it's time that I stop speaking. What's going to happen is Lisa is going to talk for 10 minutes or so, offer some reflections, and then I'll ask her a few questions. And in the remaining time before 7 o'clock, I would like you all to ask questions too. So while we're speaking, if you can fire away and write any questions you have in the chat, I'll do my best to cultivate them and ask as many as possible in the remaining time. So without further ado, a very, very warm welcome to Lisa Nandy, one of our most prestigious alumni. Thank you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you so much, Ben. And it's nice of you as well to talk through some of the things that I was saying this week. It's a bloody good job I'm not going to make the same speech today, or we'd be in real trouble. It was 1972, wasn't it, the year that Birkbeck politics began. It was a decision that would have a profound effect on my life, like many others, finding a home at Birkbeck 20 years ago to study politics, one of the most magical and creative experiences that I've had. And in the 50 years that followed, many, many people's lives have been touched by that decision. 1972 was a year with some pretty stark parallels with now. Soaring inflation, trouble in Northern Ireland, industrial unrest, the cost of living crisis. But it was also a year that for me was to have big implications too, because a speech was made that year, which went on to have a profound impact on shaping my politics and many others besides. When the trade unionist Jimmy Reid accepted an invitation to speak to students at Glasgow University. And in that speech, which became known popularly as the rat race speech, he described the feeling of alienation that permeated so many lives. He talked about the army of men who find themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, and the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the process of decision making, the feeling of despair and hopelessness, as he called it, that pervades people who feel with justification that they have no real say in shaping or determining their own destinies. This is, I believe, as true of Britain today as it was 50 years ago when Reid spoke those words. But more than that, it's what I believe lies at the heart of Britain's current crisis. An economy where most people work harder than ever before but can't make ends meet, a country where the people who have most at stake in the outcome have the least say over the decisions that are made, and the contribution of most people in most places not just written off but written out of our national story altogether. No wonder then that many people have fundamentally lost faith in the one thing that could change this, and that's politics. Now, it was that belief that only politics in the end can change this that led me into elected politics 20 years ago while I was studying at Birkbeck, and I stood for Hammersmith Council. This is it for me. This is the why, what I'm in politics to change. And it starts with geography, because for 19 of the last 20 years, only 2 regions in this country, London and the South East, have had the backing and investment to pay in more to the national pot than they take out. Our core cities are lagging not just behind London, but across similar cities in Europe. And for too long, many of our towns and villages have been written off by national government altogether. These are places that within living memory once powered the world. All that inheritance, all that contribution that should have been passed down to children and grandchildren was instead just thrown away. So now we have a settlement where young people are told, if you want to get on, you've got to get out. Where people are growing old hundreds of miles away from children and grandchildren. And the loss of that working age population has taken with it the spending power that sustains the social fabric of the place, the high streets, the pubs, the banks and the bus networks. But it isn't just that this has posed great problems for large swathes of the country, because even the winners are losing. 1 million young people make their home in London every year. I know because I was one of them all those years ago. London is the region with the highest disposable incomes by a long stretch, and it is a magnet for people from all over the world. It's a great city, an incredible city, very local and locally rooted in every community, but open and global as well, where people come together to debate and to think, as I did at Birkbeck. But faced with astronomical housing costs, those young people end up worse off than in many other parts of the UK. And I saw this for myself as a young councillor in Hammersmith and while I was at Birkbeck and working for the charity Centrepoint at the same time. And in both of those roles, I represented a generation of young people who were held back by crippling rents and children growing up in the damp, cold, overcrowded, squalid housing that shamed the nation then and shames the nation still today. A country that doesn't fire on all cylinders can't succeed. It's absurd to expect a major economy to work if you draw only on a small number of sectors in a small part of the country involving a small number of people. But to turn this around takes more than just investment. It takes all of us. Because if I've learned anything in the last 12 years as Wigan's MP, it's that people who have a stake in the outcome and skin in the game work harder, they think more creatively, and they try for longer because they can do no other. I think most of all of the mums that I've represented over the years who've been through my constituency surgery with children with special educational needs, regardless of their own background, their qualifications, their educational levels, or their confidence, they have fought and fought and fought the opaque systems and won because their children's lives were at stake. But too often when I watch those incredible people trying to build thriving, strong communities, trying to change the outcomes for themselves and for their families and trying to make a contribution to the country, I see that they're tripped up by a small few who hoard money and power and come in and extract even as they're trying to build. I see it in the council leaders who still have to go cap in hand to beg for small grants and powers to do the things they know work for their own communities. I see it in the communities fighting rogue landlords who buy up houses and claim astronomical rates of housing benefit and leave people in appalling conditions and whole communities to go to rack and ruin. I see it in the arrogance of politicians and officials in Whitehall and Westminster who sit in offices drawing lines on maps that at one stroke wipe out the bus networks and the train lines that will allow young people who they've never met to take up an apprenticeship or see friends and family. This is how you get a settlement that not only ignores the things that we value, but fails to give representation to those affected. And in a representative democracy, that is nothing short of a crisis. There are those on the left and the right, as the academic Harry Pitts and Matt Bolton put it, who luxuriate in the flames licking at the side of liberal democracy. But those flames are there, they are real, and we've got to do something about it. So here's what I want to do. I want us to tilt the system back towards the creators. Reid said in 1972, the great untapped resources of the North Sea are as nothing compared to the untapped resources of our people. I am convinced that the great mass of our people go through life without even a glimmer of what they could have contributed to their fellow human beings. This is a personal tragedy. It is a social crime. This is the spirit that I found at Birkbeck when I arrived 20 years ago, an institution that was founded to give working class people the right not just to an education, but to unleash that potential and that contribution so that we were in the driving seat of our own lives, our communities, our country, and our destiny. It's really hard looking back at that 200 years ago when Birkbeck was founded to think of a bigger challenge to the status quo. No wonder then that one of its founders, George Birkbeck, was accused of scattering the seeds of evil. Because institutions like Birkbeck matter, and make no mistake, they've come under unprecedented attack in recent years. It's the Conservative MP, actually, Jesse Norman, whose words I think of when I think of Birkbeck, when he wrote about the institutions that help to shape and define us as we help to shape and define them. And that was certainly true for me at Birkbeck, to be able to come together with people who'd led utterly different lives to debate politics was a gift. It's the answer to much of the malaise in our current political debate. Quite simply, we've lost the ability to understand one another. And it was Eric Hobsbawm who wrote that as an immigrant, he saw life at a tangent to the world. I recognised that sentiment in my dad, who came to this country in the 50s, at a time when signs like no blacks, no Irish, no dogs were prevalent. This was a man who graduated with a double-starred first in English literature from Leeds University, but was turned down by the Royal Mail, who said that his literacy was too poor to be employed as a postman. And it was this that spurred him and others on to create the Race Relations Act, one of the greatest gifts given to this country, and to build together the architecture of race equality in Britain. It's this sort of spirit, I think, that's run through my family history, but it's also what attracted me to Birkbeck and what has shaped my politics. Because as Bobby Kennedy once said, some see things that are and ask why. I see things that never were and ask why not. This is the Birkbeck spirit. It's the spirit that Jimmy Reid was urging when he urged students to reject the dog-eat-dog values that were destroying human relations and squandering human contribution. Reject the rat race, he thundered at those students. A rat race is for rats. That's the sentiment that attracted me to Birkbeck, and it's what drives me still. But more than that, I genuinely believe that it's the only way to fix our broken politics. And it is the only way to restore values that run like a silver thread through the systems we build, that enable contribution and dignity and solidarity so that all of us can live richer, larger, more dignified lives, all of us in common. The Tories call this levelling up, I call it rebuilding Britain. But regardless of that, it's a much bigger agenda than just thinking about some of the places and people that have been left behind. It's about rebuilding a Britain that works, in which everyone has a role, everyone has a stake, and everyone has the right to make a contribution again. We build that the only way that counts, and that is together. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much, and for speaking so eloquently about Birkbeck as well. It's really nice to hear something so uplifting. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of events about politics very recently, and there's a lot of things happening around the world, in the UK, where it's easy to become kind of despondent. I was going to ask you a few questions. There's some questions appearing in the chat, so I may not get through all of mine. Maybe I should ask you the really big question connecting Birkbeck to your political career. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. How did studying politics help you as a politician? Or perhaps I should say, did studying politics help you as a politician?
Do you know, it did actually. And my first tutor at Newcastle used to absolutely despair at my sort of impatience with the political theory when I wanted to do political practice. But it was Birkbeck actually. You know, I had an amazing time at Newcastle University, 3 best years of my life, and what an amazing city it was. It still gives me shivers down my spine when I go back there to think of how much fun we had and how much I grew in those 3 years. But it was Birkbeck really where I was able to connect the two together. Sitting in a seminar room, I remember one day we were debating Marxism, and it was with Jason Edwards actually, who's on this call and is on the chat. And there was there was a girl who's involved in politics in Egypt, a young woman who has gone on to have quite a significant impact on politics in the region. There was a number 10 advisor sitting in the room. There was little old me, but there was also a guy who was a tube driver by day and was studying at Birkbeck by night. And his perspective, I'll never forget, was completely different to everybody else's perspective in the room. I was losing the argument about Marxism and the analysis being relevant to modern Britain, and he just blew everybody else out of the water. And I think, you know, for me, what was really important about that was that it's the practical application of those age-old, universal sort of truths that we most grapple with in modern politics at the moment. You know, how to take those values that people were fighting for all those years ago and turn them into something that is relevant and applicable and practical right now. And I was thinking, you know, during the Brexit debates, it was a horrible time. It doesn't matter who you were or what your views were. It was just absolutely miserable to be part of that very angry, very toxic debate in which people had just stopped listening to one another. But I really reflected on the sort of the problem with a political system and political parties that have become so disconnected from those ideas. You know, one of my criticisms of the Liberals was that how could a party that was once the party of John Stuart Mill and saw that freedom, you know, and having the ability to be the, you know, as Isaiah Berlin put it, the rider, not the horse, how could it be that they'd seen Brexit and the vote to leave only as a vote for, as Vince Cable put it, nostalgia for a time when faces were white and passports were pink? You know, how could they not understand that actually over those 40 years there'd been a decline in living standards, whole places experiencing 40 years of economic decline, and families smashed apart because young people had to get out to get on. And I had similar criticisms of the Tory party and their, you know, party of Adam Smith, that were unable to see the problem with a modern economy where people hoard money and power and decisions don't work for most people. And in fact, I had similar criticisms of my own party that had become incredibly statist and centralising and paternalistic at a time when there was a clamour out there for more power, and those values of the burial societies and the cooperative societies and the trade union movement that gave birth to the Labour Party had been utterly neglected. So that's a very long way of saying that it was studying politics that enabled me to see some of the very real problems with modern politics in every political tradition, not just some.
That's really interesting, and obviously really positive for us as a politics department to hear that it is kind of abuse. Maybe just to push on that question slightly, I'm interested. Did you ever which topics did you enjoy at Birkbeck, and did you ever come across them in your later political career and say, there we are, or, you know, did you pick up a theory and see kind of what it meant? Was there ever sort of resonant moments when it really came into play?
I think the biggest thing for me was I just really enjoyed the clash of ideas. It was a really constructive place to be able to do it, and it was encouraged. And people were, you know, we would carry on the debate in the pub long after the seminars had finished because we were enjoying it so much. I mean, I have to say, and this is probably going to ruin everything I've said before, I don't remember enjoying doing a master's degree very much. I was working at Centrepoint during the day with homeless teenagers. I was a counsellor in Hammersmith and Fulham in the evening, and I was also trying to do a master's degree as well. I do remember sort of crying a lot during that time and moaning a lot about having to go to seminars when what I really wanted to do was go to the pub with my mates. But it was so worth the experience, and it was worth it partly because of what I learned, but most of all, I think, because of the people that I met and the ideas that I came into contact with.
That's great. I mean, that's exactly my experience of being a teacher here. We spoke to Johnny Lovendusky yesterday, who you may have known. I think she was here when you were here. And she said the one thing you could always be certain about at Birkbeck is that somebody in the class knew more about a topic than the teacher did. We can make teaching interesting sometimes, but it is really, really amazing. I was going to flip forward to your political career, maybe, and get you to reflect on that. Looking now, I mean, you've been in politics for a long time. You've been in the House of Commons since 2010. What are the best and worst parts of being a politician here in kind of 2022?
Um, I mean, the worst part, I suppose, is that it's really. I went from working in the charity sector to being a member of parliament, and it's really difficult in the face of understandable scepticism and cynicism about politics and politicians. The last few years, particularly, the Brexit wars did a lot of damage, I think, to the political debate. I don't think any of us can escape responsibility for how we conducted that debate in the country. We found multiple ways to divide ourselves from one another. And we've seen a lot of politicians of all political parties over the 12 years I've been in Parliament trying to stoke those divisions, whether it's yes, no, leave, remain, north, south. It's one of the reasons why I utterly reject northern politicians who say that levelling up is about London getting its just desserts and the north benefiting over the south, just as I utterly reject those southern politicians who have tried to argue that the north should just pipe down and be quiet and the status quo is utterly acceptable. For me, this is nothing, this is not about whether we hand out more small pots of money to different parts of the country. This is about fundamentally smashing up, as you said at the beginning, a century of centralisation, restoring power into the hands of people who rightfully own it so that they can use it to build and the country can fire on all cylinders again. And it is hard to get that message across when people are so divided. A house divided cannot stand. And so fighting for unity at times over those 12 years, it's been characterised as the weak position and the unprincipled position. Certainly I felt like during Brexit, when some of us were asking for a compromise, 52-48, the mandate was for compromise and negotiation, and we were being characterised as unprincipled and weak. I think we're turning a corner on that, though, because actually what I've learned in the last 12 years is that anger and that division and that despair is not driven by something negative, it's driven by something really positive. That there's an ambition in every community in this country that is currently unmatched by the political system that we have and the government that we have. And we could change that, we could genuinely change it. And I guess that's my favourite bit of the job, is that we could, is that I can feel the ground sort of shifting beneath my feet. I feel like this is one of those moments of enormous change where people have said that the settlement just isn't good enough. In the 1945, the Attlee government stepped into that space after the war when things had fundamentally shifted and expectations had shifted, and built public housing in record numbers and brought goods back into common ownership. And in the 70s, my parents' generation were part of that, under the Wilson government and others, where women and immigrants and working class kids had much bigger ambitions than were the opportunities that were on offer, and they responded with the Race Relations Act and the Equal Pay Act and the comprehensive education reforms. And the Labour government in the 90s, I think, responded to globalisation with a big push around education and trying to equip young people for the skills that they would need to survive and to thrive in an era of globalisation. I feel like this is one of those moments again, and we've got to rise to the moment, and that genuinely is a privilege to be in a place to be able to influence that. And hopefully in the end, as Marx once said, the point is to change it, and hopefully in the end to change it.
Thank you, Lisa. That actually, well, two things to say. One is, it is said that Karl Marx was a very early student at Birkbeck, so I thought I'd just drop that in there. Secondly, it segues very nicely into my next question. So this is the kind of magic wand question. If you could change one single thing about the British political system, what would it be?
I mean, just like this, maybe because I've literally just got back from, got home, but I do think there is a real problem with how little time we spend with the people that we represent and how much time we spend with each other. I think you get a level of groupthink that is really dangerous. Saw it during the Iraq War, but we've seen it as well. I've mentioned Brexit a few times, and I don't mean to keep returning to it, but it was for me very much the moment when I realised that politics had become very disconnected from the country, because in places like Wigan, we'd been seeing falling turnout from 2005 onwards that we said was apathy, Then we saw this huge dramatic rise in support for UKIP in a town where working class people had run the far right out of town over and over again for 100 years. And we said it was racism. And then we had the vote to leave and we said it was xenophobia. And actually, that's the sign of a representative democracy that just isn't able to properly represent people. We've got to find a way to connect, not them back up with us, but us back up with the people. And that means, I think, we've got to spend less time in those closed rooms together and more time out and rooted in the country.
You think MPs should spend more time in their constituency and work more closely with people?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think actually this is, I was reflecting on it at the Local Government Association conference yesterday in Harrogate, that the best councils that I've ever worked with are the ones who partner with their people, and they put people in the driving seat of decisions, and they walk alongside them to provide the tools and the resources to enable them to make the change that they want to see. That's the system of government that I believe in. I don't think you can do it all from the centre, but I think the centre absolutely has a role. National government matters in my lifetime like never before. You look at some of the big challenges that are absolutely clobbering communities at the moment. What are they? They're things that only national governments working together can solve, like climate change and the flooding that afflicts large swathes of the country, with homes and businesses underwater every year now with alarming frequency, or the global criminal gangs that are defrauding older people out of their life savings, or the way in which foreign investors are able to come in and buy up town centres and leave them to go to rack and ruin, and the community is unable to do anything at all. And there was one moment that I've seen in the last decade where I felt that perhaps this might start to change. It was when Joe Biden led the charge for a global minimum corporation tax at the G7. It was our government that held out longer than any others against it. But this is money that corporations who base themselves in places like Barnsley are bleeding out of our communities by not paying their fair share in tax. They pit countries against one another in a race to the bottom, and we all lose. And that was a really landmark moment. I know he gets a lot of flack, Joe Biden, but that was a moment of real global leadership for me that showed that things can, and eventually I think they will be different.
Thanks, Victor. Actually, while you were talking about this, a question's just come up in the chat, which I think it'd be really nice to return to, about decentralisation. I asked this question of any politicians that come across my path, and so I'm going to ask you too, which is, which politician now or in the past, or politicians, do you really admire, and why?
I mean, there are lots, and they come from all sorts of different political backgrounds. I sort of feel a little hesitant to single out one, because it's slightly what I tend to do is, as I've done in every walk of life, is I look for the features of people that I really admire and try and emulate them. But you've got, the one thing that you've got to be in modern politics, I think, is authentic. It's the one thing that people are just desperate for, and the public can smell it when you're not being authentic. I've learned over the last 12 years as the MP for Wigan, in a town where I have rubbed up against the views of my constituents on a number of issues, whether it was equal marriage for some of my constituents that, I have a large Catholic community and some felt very strongly against, I felt very strongly for, or whether it was Brexit, because I voted to remain and most of my constituents voted to leave. I've learned that what they won't forgive is when you're being inauthentic and not genuine. That my constituents will happily debate with me the issues and tell me that they think I'm wrong. What they won't put up with is when they think that I'm not being sincere. So I think the politicians at the moment who I think are getting most traction with the public and are most sort of resonant are the people who are just absolutely straight. Now, some of them probably aren't straight. There's been a rise in sort of populist, sort of strongman leaders who style themselves as straightforward, down-to-earth guys, and are doing precisely the opposite. They're hoaxing the public. But I think that quality of genuineness is really important at the moment. Sorry, I completely ducked the question. I just think there is a problem for me with this question, right? And it's the same as the debate constantly in the Labour Party that we always have about who should be leader. We've been having it for years, and everyone's always sort of, I get dragged into these debates quite a lot. Is that, one thing that I really have learned during all the time that I've spent, not just in elected politics, but also at Centrepoint and the Children's Society, is that one man alone is not enough. It takes a movement, and if you want to create change that lasts, you need lots of people pulling in the same direction. That's my dad said to me, that's the lesson of his generation and the Race Relations Act and the state of Britain now, and the state of that debate now, is that you hand the baton on to the next generation, and they've got to get in the boat and row as hard as they can, because there'll be people rowing in the other direction. And I think that's been the lesson for me of the last 12 years. Progress is not inevitable, and if you want a better country, you have to go out and fight for it every day.
Thank you, Lisa. I wondered if I could just ask a question kind of following on to that. Obviously, you grew up in a household with lots of sort of inspirational figures around you in your family. And of course, you had all these life experiences, from local politics to working for charities, that all kind of helped you think about what you wanted to do. And actually, it's a really fascinating question around political science generally, and also around gender and politics. Where do you think your kind of ambition to become a politician came from?
I know exactly where it was, actually. So I went to work for a guy called Neil Gerard after I left university, who was Stella Creasy's predecessor. He was phenomenal, and his big interest was housing and refugees, because it was so relevant to what was happening in Walthamstow at the time. And he was one of those people who didn't just see things and say why, but see things that never were and said, why not? And during those New Labour years, when the government had a big majority and the political debate was becoming very, very close, he was an absolute breath of fresh air. But I hated working in Parliament. I found it institutional and closed and detached. And so I went off to work for Centrepoint. And it was there that I really thought, this is what I want to do. Because two things happened to me. The first was that we did a report about young people who were in bed and breakfast accommodation, and we found, I went and interviewed a 16-year-old who'd been raped in one of the B&Bs that she'd been placed into. I had another one who was being sexually abused by the owner of the B&B. And I went to see some of the councils where this was happening and said, you've got to do something about this, because this is happening on your watch. And it was Hammersmith and Fulham that responded best and most quickly. And they took every single young person out of bed and breakfast accommodation and put them into supported accommodation. And they became the model that the entire country followed, and the legislation passed a couple of years later. And I thought, these kids are as ambitious for themselves, their lives, their communities, as any other young person. And yet the odds are stacked against them, often from before they're even born. We live in a country where what your parents do, their educational background and their income, determines your life to a greater extent than any other single factor. And it just, after working with them, then working with young refugees for the Children's Society, I just thought, this just won't do. For all that we're doing to support these amazing young people, the system is rigged. And if you want to change the system, you've got to change where power lies, and only politics can do it. And that was the moment I decided to stand for Parliament there and then.
That's really nice to hear. It's really wonderful to hear how kind of life experiences can bring people forward into politics, especially when there's a lot of kind of cynicism about how people come to be in politics or why they want to be there. So my final question for you, because this chat is kind of exploding at the minute, so I'm going to cultivate a few questions from there in the time we've got left. Okay, my final question for you: if Lisa Nandy in 2022 could go back and speak to Lisa Nandy, the candidate for Wigan in 2010, and you could give them one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think it'd probably be to chill out a bit. I mean, I worried a lot about everything when I first got elected. And, it's good to do that. It shows you take it seriously. I have to say, still now, as I did as a what was that, 29, 30-year-old standing for Parliament for the first time, I used to feel sick every time I stood up in the chamber. I still do now. And I think that's good. I think that's right. You should take it seriously. It should matter to you that you get it right. But I think just that you can get so caught up in trying not to make mistakes that you can take your eye off the ball and forget what it is that you're actually there to do. People do make mistakes, and I think the public are quite forgiving of us for doing it. They're also quite forgiving of us in fact quite welcoming of us when we want to change our minds, and when we can learn and grow and develop, and they can see that happening, and they can see the impact they're having on us as politicians. And I think so. I'd just say, just chill out a bit, worry less about it, because the things that I'm most proud of that I've been part of in politics are things like flipping the debate, so that instead of calling towns that voted to leave thick and racist, people started to say, you know what, actually, we've written out their contribution here, and that's not acceptable. I'm going to turn that around. Levelling Up was born from that sort of work that people like us at the Centre for Towns and others were doing, and being able to get those voices amplified onto the national stage and turn that debate on its head. You know, that's what we're in politics to do, not to worry about getting the script right and getting the lines right and not making a mistake. Like, politics is hard because life is hard, and politics is complicated because life is complicated, and you are going to get it wrong sometimes, but that's all right. You just pick yourself up and start to say it right.
It's hard, I suppose, for us. I mean, we study politics, but very few of us are politicians. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine the kind of sheer intensity of the job, how much there is to do, and how difficult many of the tasks are when we do them. Okay, so I'm going to grab a couple of questions here. There's a few questions kind of about policy, if I can throw them your way, and then a few wider questions, particularly about kind of higher education. So one question from Gillian is, how do you kind of launch a fight back against the right to buy, which obviously has been in the news in the last week or so?
I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that the policy that was announced recently is not a right to buy. So the government announced two things. They announced that they were going to extend a right to buy to housing association tenants, but it's a voluntary scheme. So the housing associations have to agree to do it. It might help a small number of people. The government says they'll replace any lost stock like for like, but they've never ever done that. So the problem is that although it might help a very small number of people, it also has the potential to keep lots more families stuck in private rented accommodation when they want to be in home ownership, or in poor quality housing, unable to get into to social housing that they so desperately need. So I mean, that, you know, that one is a bit of an irrelevance, I think, in terms of, you know, it could cause a bit of harm. It's going to have fairly limited impact, and even the government accepts it. But the second thing they announced was that you would be able to have your benefits count towards getting a mortgage. This is a really good idea in principle, but in practice, they haven't done any of the hard graft talking to the mortgage companies about whether they would accept it. So far, not a single one has said that they would. So it's not worth the paper that it's written on. I think instead of these gimmicks, we need to think seriously about housing in this country as the basis of a secure life. You know, it's not the be all and end all of a decent life, but it's the base from which you build. That's what I started to understand when I was working at Centrepoint. And when you see it like that, housing is a human right, and we need to treat it like that. What does that mean in practice? It means that we need to get more homes built, decent homes, affordable homes, good quality homes. We've got to get rid of we've got to work locally to do that, because local places have a vision for their own places. You know, my council, for example, has been saying for years, we can build the sort of homes that people need, but we've got to build them in the right places. We've got loads of brownfield land, but it's contaminated land because of the industrial heritage here. So we just need a bit of funding to be able to turn that around. The government has, in fairness to them, has finally listened to that. But the point is that we're building places, not just homes. And so it has to be driven and shaped locally. And it also means that we've got to get rid of things like the bedroom tax, an appalling policy, because what it did was it forced a lot of people out of family-sized homes, which councils had built because people wanted them, into the private rented sector. It didn't just mean that we were paying more in housing benefit and people lost their homes, which was heartbreaking enough as it was, but it meant that, you know, I had young mums having to move their kids away from the school where they were doing well, and away from their own mums who provided the childcare, to completely different parts of the community. That is just an act of vandalism, and we need to start seeing housing as the human right that it is, as homes, not just units of accommodation.
Thank you, Lisa. maybe just picking up a few questions are along a kind of a similar track here. So both Martin and Luke are asking the question about devolution and decentralization. Martin's pointed out that lots of governments come to power promising devolution, and it does arrive sometimes, but other times it doesn't. And Luke is asking from a slightly different angle, what does a properly decentralized United Kingdom look like to you? And I suppose the question there is there a kind of model you're following? Is there an inspiration? Of course, we're hearing a lot about things like the Preston model, you know, and other ways of doing local government within the British system. So do you have a vision or a plan or a kind of idea of what it would look like?
Yeah, so the first thing is whether we do it, because all oppositions say they want to give away power and governments rarely do. So let me try and sort of take that head on, because there are two things for me that are different this time. One is that this is, you know, I was really struck talking to people like Jack Straw and John Prescott, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, people who were very involved in this debate, you know, setting up the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the you know, and the regional development agencies as well under the last Labour government. And they, you know, I think the difference now is that our analysis in Labour about what has gone wrong in the economy for the whole country, not just for the regions, is this level of regional inequality, the fact that we've written out and written off the contribution, the assets and the potential in large parts of the country. So, you know, there's a reason why advanced manufacturing is in Rotherham. It's because the legacy of skills from steel cutting made it an ideal place to invest, and because you had a regional development agency that was rooted in Yorkshire, and the man who ran it lived in Yorkshire. His parents and grandparents had worked in the steel industry, and so he understood the assets and the potential that were there, and he was willing to take a punt and put some money behind it all those years ago in order to create one of the most amazing success stories of British industry. So first of all, we don't see it as about simply about sort of managing the regions. We see this as the crux of the problem that Britain faces, both economically and politically, and that's why we've got to set it right. So it runs like a thread through everything that we do. But the second thing is that this is my politics. This is what drives me. That I turned up at Centrepoint as a 22-year-old, utterly in favour of big states, big interventionist states and big national programmes. And I learned very quickly that we didn't make change and the government didn't make change. Those young people made the change. What we had to do was provide them with the tools, the support and the resources to do it. And in every walk of life, that's what I've seen. I spotted there's a question in the chat as well about a progressive alliance. You know, I'm such a fan of working together with the broadest possible coalition that I literally wrote a book about this with Caroline Lucas a few years ago and a Liberal Democrat called Chris Bowers, because I just think, you know, for all the people that I've ever represented, those homeless teenagers, those refugee children, the constituents I represent now, they haven't got time for me to muck about saying I'm only prepared to work with people I agree with. They need change, and that means that I've got to go and do the hard yards of politics, convincing people and negotiate in the future. So we are going to do it, but what does it look like? Well, first of all, I suppose there are some broad principles behind how you go about doing this. The first for me is that we trickle out economics has failed in the same way as trickle down economics has failed. So you can't just invest in some places and expect that the benefits will flow through to others. You've got to think about the assets and the contribution potential everywhere. You know, look at Grimsby, for example, where kids from the East Marsh estate in Grimsby are now powering the world from the Grimsby docks. That's for one reason alone. Grimsby is the windiest place in Europe. That's its asset. And that asset doesn't exist in a lot of major cities. But, you know, if you only look at what's happening in some parts of the country, you miss all that potential and all of that contribution. I think the second thing for me is that just simply moving power from one group of men in Whitehall to another group of men in the town hall does not constitute devolution. I want to see communities in the driving seat. So we've made some strides forward with how to do that in recent years. And I'll give you one example and then I'll stop talking because this is a big topic and we could do it all day. But Wigan Athletic went into administration a few years ago and we were devastated. It's a club that stood at the centre of our town for 100 years and it means the world to a lot of people. We were given the right to buy it because there's legislation that gives fans the first dibs on whether you want to buy the club. And the administrators rang me up and said, you can have it. Have you got £16 million? I mean, you know, what use are these rights unless you've got the assets behind it? So one of the things that we're really keen on is that we extend and deepen devolution so that it reaches the people and people are in the driving seat. And that means that people need the powers to be able to deliver. So those legal rights that are written into law that allow them to drive those decisions, they need the assets. And we're looking at how you can build assets within communities at the moment. I'm going over to Germany to see how they're doing it next week. And you need a national government that does its job, which is to clear the pitch so that people can build, stop people coming in from extracting and undermining those efforts, stop people from hoarding money and power, and stop people making short-term decisions that make them a quick buck at the expense of most people who are trying to invest for the long haul.
I was maybe going to actually pick up on that question because Jason Edwards, who you may know, has also just asked a question in the chat. And he's asked, is the problem not just about geography? Is it not also, you know, about the way in which the political system kind of entrenches political inequality and reinforces it? And is there a kind of way out of that?
I saw Jason's question, and particularly like the example of people wanting PR, because it's the sort of democratic change that enables more people to have their voices heard and to influence and drive those decisions. I think for me, the strongest argument that I've seen for PR, actually, people might not like this as an example, but it was the EU referendum, because people were coming out to vote in that biggest democratic engagement exercise, I think, in my lifetime, because they knew that everything was at stake, and they knew that it would make the difference. And so they were exercising their right to vote. And contrary to what, the state of the debate was just appalling, national debate. I was in those debates, and it was just, it's just people shouting facts at each other and, not really engaging with public concerns at all. But the way in which people approached that, I didn't feel was simplistic at all. I remember standing in Wigan Town Centre with Ed Miliband. I'm not sure why we were doing it. We had a great big red bus, and we were trying to convince people to vote Remain. And people were coming up and saying to us, "Is it true that we're going to get this extra money for the National Health Service?" I'm not sure I believe them, but I want to hear the other side of the story. People were genuinely engaging with it, and I think this point about it's not just about economic regeneration. It's about people having the ability to shape and drive those decisions and drive the political debate itself. I think Jason is right, actually. I think that what we've seen in Germany, in France, with the Gilets jaunes movement, we saw it in the US with the rise of Donald Trump, and here in the UK as well, including in Scotland, as well as in England, where we've got rising nationalism. I think what we're seeing is a revolt against a political system that doesn't give representation to people and doesn't allow people to be in the driving seat of decisions that affect themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Thank you, and thank you, Jason, for that. You are right, according to Lisa Nandy, Jason. You'll be pleased to know.
On that, I mean, qualify that.
I was going to ask a question about higher education. There's been a Caroline Edwards and also my colleague Dean Eatis, who both ask kind of similar questions, because actually higher education, of course, does feed into the agenda about levelling up. And there's been some discussion quite recently about the role of, particularly, in the north of England, about the role of higher education institutions in kind of smaller cities and towns. So there's kind of two questions here. One is, how can we best protect some of the institutions of higher education? We've been hearing, stories about redundancies and job threats, all over the United Kingdom. And also, to flip it over to the more positive side, is there a way that we can use some of the principles, such as that Birkbeck espouses, about kind of opening up higher education for everyone, to help with the agenda on kind of rebuilding Britain? So how can we protect institutions under threat, and how can we kind of make this into a more positive thing and open up higher education?
So I think I think the thing that has disturbed me the most about the attack on higher education has been the attempt to invoke universities as part of the culture wars by sections of the government. I think that's been really pernicious. I think this is part of a sort of chilling effect on free speech and democratic participation and engagement that takes you only to a very dark place. So I think resisting the culture wars and this kind of attack on universities is a really important first step. I think there's clearly an issue about funding of higher education. Bridget Phillipson is our spokesperson on this, so I'm not allowed to just make policy on the hoof because that never ends well. But there is definitely, I mean, it's clear that there are funding pressures for higher education, and particularly the model that has allowed a lot of that stress and that insecurity to be passed down to the people who work in it. Seen that in many other walks of life as well. See it particularly in the National Health Service at the moment and in the education system as well. But there's a real problem there because, when I think back to when I was at Newcastle and then at Birkbeck, it was the people that were the magic ingredient. Joni Lovendusky scared the living daylights out of me, but I learned a lot from her. And it was, it was the tutors that I had that really helped me to think differently and get through some quite tough times over those 2 years. So I think we've got to think about how we change that model so that the insecurity and the risk and the stress isn't loaded onto the people that are really the biggest asset of the system. And then I guess finally I would just say that I think that there is more that the university sector can do in order to build support and consensus for those institutions around the country. I mean, I'll give you an example here. UCLan, which is a phenomenally good university in my view, is working closely with my local college, Wigan and Leigh College, to base itself here because we've got real chronic transport problems in the north of England, as you probably know, because we're always banging on about it and nothing ever gets done. The young people, the students can't necessarily move, so they've moved to the university and it bases itself in the college, but it doesn't do what some of the bigger red brick universities have tried to do, which is come in and replicate what we're doing and cherry pick profitable courses. It genuinely partners with Wigan and with what's already here. And that is the sort of model and ethos that I think would build really significant support for the university sector across this country, particularly in places where there's been a desert of higher education for quite a long time.
That's very encouraging, Lisa. Thank you, and nice to hear it at a time like this. Okay, I think we're nearly out of time. I was just going to ask you one last question myself, if I may, which is we find actually quite a lot of people at Birkbeck go into politics or want to go into politics. We have people running to be local councillors, candidates, and I wondered if finally, for the benefit of our audience listening, a lot of whom are students, do you have any kind of pieces of advice or tips for them, for anybody who's thinking about a political career and would like to go in?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First thing I'd say is confidence is important. Jess Phillips is quite good at this. She sort of, she said she looked at the Parliament and thought, I can't do that. And then she looked at a lot of the people that were doing it, especially the men, and thought, I can so do it better than that. So, don't be put off by lack of confidence. It took me a long time to find my voice and to find my feet. I did genuinely wonder if someone like me could do it. And that's crazy when you think that I come from a background where, we've got politicians in my family, and yet I really didn't know if I could. We tried to change it a lot in politics recently. We had this sort of pact between the women in Parliament a few years ago because there were no women chairing select committees, which was just appalling. So we designate chairs of select committees by political party, and we just had a pact that whichever political party was occupying the chair, we would just vote for the women. The women would vote for the women, and we got women chairs of the business committee, of the treasury, of home affairs. It was a game changer, and actually it's encouraged more women to stand because they see themselves reflected at those highest levels. And the second thing I would just say is that politics is about people. And that sounds very trite, but it's true. So if you want to get selected and elected, just invest in those relationships with people. You know, people appreciate it, and kind of what goes around comes around. If you do people a favour and you work hard for them and you treat them decently, you do tend to get it back in return.
Lisa, thank you so much. I wonder if everybody could send Lisa a thank you in the chat, or give her a wave to say thank you for such an interesting talk. The little hand waving symbol allows you to wave to Lisa. So I'd love everybody to say thank you to you. One of the things about Birkbeck is that it's wonderful and slightly intimidating, the quality of the people who are there. And it's just been amazing to have you speak with us, Lisa. I know you're extraordinarily busy. You're going all over the place doing all sorts of things. So for you to give us 60 minutes of your time is absolutely amazing. So I think you can see everybody here is extraordinarily grateful. So thank you so much, Lisa. Good luck with everything. You're more than welcome back to Birkbeck anytime to do anything, a talk or visiting the classes. Hopefully one day in person would be absolutely wonderful. But good luck with everything. And thank you for being such an inspirational figure for our 50th anniversary celebrations. Thank you so much, and have a nice evening, everybody. And thank you most of all to Lisa.
Oh, thank you so much.